4 Iranian-made drones crossed the air interdiction line over the Strait of Hormuz in the early hours of a morning when radars at United States Central Command registered what Pentagon officials described in a classified memo leaked to the Financial Times as the most significant Iranian aerial provocation over international waters in the Persian Gulf since the shootdown of the RQ-4 Global Hawk drone in June of 2019. The 4 aircraft, variants of the Shahed family, the same model Iran exports to Russia for use in the war against Ukraine, flew at less than 300 meters of altitude over the most critical shipping lane on the planet, remained in the disputed airspace for 26 minutes and returned to the Iranian coast without a single shot being fired by either side. 26 minutes. The equivalent of 1 emergency meeting in a crisis cabinet, and in that interval, the price of Brent crude jumped $4.60, the largest intraday move in energy markets since the attack on the Abqaiq terminals in Saudi Arabia in 2019. The central paradox of this provocation was as precise as it was calculated. The Strait of Hormuz is a waterway with a navigable width of just 3 kilometers at its narrowest point, a corridor through which approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass every day, the equivalent of 21% of all global fossil fuel consumption. Any disruption to this artery, even one lasting 48 hours, triggers a cascade effect that reaches from the price of gasoline at a pump in Sao Paulo to the cost of container freight in the South China Sea. And Iran, by sending 4 drones with an estimated unit cost of less than $20,000 each over this passage, had demonstrated that it possessed the capacity to threaten a commercial flow valued at more than $2 trillion annually, with equipment that costs less than a standard automobile on the European market. But the true impact of this operation went far beyond the numbers on the battlefield. What Tehran had executed was not an attack. It was a calibrated demonstration of asymmetric capability, the kind of operation that irregular warfare manuals describe as coercive signaling. In practice, the message was directed simultaneously at 3 audiences: at the United States, whose 5th Fleet operates out of Bahrain, less than 400 kilometers from the drone's point of penetration; at Israel, whose operations against Iranian targets in Syria and on Iranian territory itself had intensified in the weeks prior; and at global energy markets, which function as involuntary amplifiers of any Iranian military gesture in that region. Every additional minute those drones remained airborne over Hormuz was one more minute of pressure on the countries most dependent on that resource. Countries that would in turn create pressure on Washington that the White House, sooner or later, could not afford to ignore. Step back for a moment and look at the full picture. Iran did not arrive at this point by accident. The Iranian drone program, conducted under the direct supervision of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the parallel military force answerable directly to the supreme leader, operating alongside the conventional army, had transformed itself over the past decade into the most cost-efficient power projection instrument of any regional power in the world. According to estimates from the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, Iran operates an arsenal of more than 3,000 drones of varying ranges and capabilities, produced at a total cost lower than that of a single squadron of F-35 fighter jets from the American Air Force. 3,000 aircraft for the price of 12 planes. The equation had changed, and there was a layer we had not yet touched, one that changes the nature of this analysis entirely. The greatest paradox of the Iranian provocation over Hormuz was not what the drones could do to international maritime traffic. It was what any real escalation would do to Iran itself. Tehran depends on the Strait of Hormuz to export approximately 1,300,000 barrels of oil per day. the principal source of revenue for a state whose economy already operates under the weight of more than 3,500 international sanctions, the most extensive restrictions regime applied to any country in the world. An effective blockade of the Strait would destroy the Iranian economy before it destroyed any other. And here was the paradox that planners had not calculated with sufficient transparency for their own populations. The weapon the regime had deployed to wound the enemy was, in that moment, pointed directly at its own source of income. The greatest paradox of the entire crisis lay precisely here. The weapon the regime had launched to hurt the enemy was, at that very moment, destroying its own revenue stream. Not through the shot itself, but through the mere possibility of it. Consider carefully what this number means in practice. The geopolitical risk premium, the additional value markets charge above the oil price when there is a threat of conflict in a producing region, had risen to more than $8 per barrel in the weeks following the drone provocation. $8 per barrel over 21 million barrels transiting Hormuz daily means $168 million in additional costs paid every day by global energy consumers, more than $5 billion per month transferred from the pockets of drivers, industries and governments into the accounts of traders and producers who profit from instability. Chaos has a price, and someone always collects it. In the shadow of this monumental strategic miscalculation, one actor was watching everything with calculated satisfaction. And here was the actor that headlines were not mentioning with the frequency the data warranted: China. Beijing purchases approximately 90% of all exported Iranian oil, largely at discounts reaching $15 per barrel below market price. Discounts that exist only because Western sanctions have eliminated most other buyers. Every escalation in the Persian Gulf reinforces Tehran's dependence on Beijing and increases Chinese bargaining power over price, volume, and payment terms. China did not need to fire a single missile or position a single warship. It simply had to wait for Iran and the United States to keep escalating. And every step of that escalation made Iranian oil cheaper at the Chinese negotiating table. And here was what that layer revealed about the real geometry of the conflict. Admiral Abbas Nilfarushan, Deputy Commander of the IRGC for Operational Affairs, a 62-year-old officer who had personally coordinated the development of Iran's drone swarm doctrine and who publicly used the epithet "architect of the mosquito" in reference to the philosophy of striking expensive targets with cheap weapons, had declared in an interview with the Tasnim news agency that the Strait of Hormuz was the artery that Iran can compress at any moment without needing to sever it. This man is not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He is the investigative coordinate of what Iranian military doctrine had become, a machine of asymmetric pressure designed to make the cost of confrontation unbearable for the adversary without ever crossing the line that would justify a full conventional military retaliation. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic with the greatest precision is not the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which everyone would expect as the reference point for a confrontation between powers over a strategic passage. It is the tanker war in the Persian Gulf of 1988, when Iran scattered rudimentary naval mines, each costing less than $1,500, across the shipping lanes of Hormuz, and managed to damage the American frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts, whose repair cost more than $130 million. A $1,500 mine against a $130 million ship. The cost ratio was 1 to nearly 90,000. In 2026, Shahed drones had replaced mines as the instrument of asymmetry, but the logic remained identical, and the cost ratio had become even more brutal for the American side. Each Shahed drone that the defensive systems of the destroyer USS Carney intercepted with an SM-2 missile cost the United States Navy approximately $2,100,000 in munitions to destroy an aircraft worth $20,000. The age of cheap and feared attacks had not ended. It had been industrialized, and so we arrive at the question no analyst was answering with sufficient clarity. The United States permanently maintains between 40 and 60 warships in the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea region, including at least one carrier strike group. The daily operational cost of this presence, according to data from the Congressional Budget Office, the non-partisan congressional office that calculates military expenditures, exceeds $20 million per day. $7,300 million per year to protect a 3-kilometer-wide corridor against drones that cost less than a used car. Look at what this reveals about the dynamics of the conflict. Iran had found a way to impose astronomical costs on the world's greatest military power without ever engaging in direct combat. Using equipment it could produce at industrial scale inside facilities that American satellites had already photographed, but that American missiles could not strike without triggering a regional war with incalculable consequences. But there was a layer we had not yet touched. The drones that crossed Hormuz in the early hours of that morning were not merely surveillance or provocation platforms. According to an assessment published by the British Ministry of Defence 3 days after the incident, at least 2 of the 4 aircraft carried target designation systems capable of transmitting real-time coordinates to NOR anti-ship missile batteries. The Iranian version of the Chinese C-802, with a range of 120 kilometers, positioned along the Iranian coastline in the Gulf. In practice, the drones functioned as the forward eyes of an integrated strike system that could, in theory, hit any vessel transiting the Strait without the missile launcher needing to detect the target with its own radar. The plan had failed to provoke the reaction that would have justified an escalation, but the demonstrated capability remained intact. And here was what that detail changed. This is not merely a question of territory on a map. It is a question of who controls the energy arteries of the 21st century. And the outcome of this test will redraw the map of global power for decades. Every Iranian provocation over Hormuz forces the United States to maintain an unsustainably expensive naval presence in the Gulf, diverts resources the Pentagon would prefer to position in the Pacific to counter China, elevates the global price of energy in a way that benefits Russia, which also exports oil and gas, and strengthens precisely the 2 adversaries Washington fears most, all without Tehran needing to fire a single projectile. Russia cannot sustain its hemorrhaging in Ukraine indefinitely, and the end of that period will determine the future not of one country, but of all of Europe. And every additional dollar the barrel of oil gains because of the chaos at Hormuz is one additional dollar in Moscow's war chest. The new paradigm that those 26 minutes over the Persian Gulf established will not be reversed by diplomatic statements or naval exercises meant to project force, because the cost asymmetry Iran has discovered works precisely against demonstrations of force, making every American response more expensive than the provocation that generated it. The strategic question that remains open and that will define the next chapter of this crisis is whether Washington will accept paying $7 billion annually in perpetuity to police a 3-kilometer strait, or whether domestic pressure and the need to reposition assets in the Pacific will force a partial withdrawal that Tehran will interpret as license to escalate, and that Beijing will celebrate in silence as the first American naval retreat in the Gulf since 1979. The drones returned to the Iranian coast. The message remained over the water. If this script revealed a layer of the conflict you had not yet considered, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this crisis is already being written over the waters of Hormuz, and it will not wait for the morning news.